This man died in 1841, and yet his head is still perfectly preserved. It once belonged to Diego Alves, although it still technically does. And between 1836 to 1840, he killed 70 people. But at the time, they didn't even know these people were being murdered. That's because of how he would do it. In the capital of Portugal, there was a giant aqueduct that would essentially connect one side of the land, the rural side, to the city. Essentially like a giant bridge. Therefore, many farmers would cross this regularly so they could sell their goods in the city. Diego knew this, so he would hide on the aqueduct at night and then jump out when the farmers were passing. He would rob them and then proceed to push them over the side of the aqueduct, and they would fall 213 feet to their death. For a long time, authorities assumed that these people were jumping willingly. But once 70 people started to jump from the same spot, it became clear that there was a pattern. He was eventually caught and executed in February of 1841. And at the time, scientists were intrigued to see how a seemingly normal-looking person could commit such horrific crimes without any remorse. So after execution, they removed his head so they could study his brain. Although, at the lack of medical advancements and technology, they weren't able to do much. But it was put in a jar of formaldehyde, and it's still on display to this day at the University of Lisbon's Faculty of Medicine.
In 2022, the town of Slaughter, Louisiana was shaken by the death of 36-year-old Lacey Fletcher. Lacey suffered from a medical condition known as locked-in syndrome, making her almost completely paralyzed. Due to her medical condition, Lacey spent all of her life at home, as she began to develop some degree of Asperger's syndrome. Lacey's parents were her caretakers, although they neglected that responsibility and treated Lacey inhumanely, leaving her to relieve herself on the same couch that she spent most of her life. Lacey's neighbors stated that the last time they saw her in public was 15 years before this incident. At the time of her death, Lacey weighed 96 pounds and had contracted COVID-19. On January 3rd, 2022, Lacey was found dead in a couch covered in feces and urine. It was believed that she was in that same spot for years without being catered to. Her body was covered in ulcers, her hair matted and filled with maggots. Her parents, Sheila and Clay Fletcher, were charged with second-degree murder and detained for the severe chronic neglect. Despite all of this, they pleaded not guilty and were released on bail. Sheila and Clay Fletcher will begin trial on June 19, 2023.
This man went on Amazon to review the products he was using during his murders. Todd Colehep was a South Carolina realtor who owned 95 acres of property, and it was on this property that he hired the help of Kayla Brown and her boyfriend Charles Carver. Immediately upon arriving, he shot Charles and forced Kayla into this shipping container where she would be held for 2 months. During Kayla's captivity, Todd revealed to her that he was actually a serial killer, and was not only responsible for the murders of another couple, but was also responsible for the mass shooting that took the lives of 4 people at Superbike Motorsports in Chesney, South Carolina. Until Todd's confession, this shooting was actually unsolved for 13 years, and police even considered the pregnant wives of one of the victims to be the main suspect. His motive for the shooting was because they refused to return a motorcycle he had purchased there. After Kayla Brown was rescued from the shipping container where she was chained up like a dog, she revealed that Todd was hoping she would form Stockholm Syndrome and that he was building a home for them with a soundproof area where Kayla would be held indefinitely. But when police arrived, they found a pre-dug hole next to where Charles was buried and believed that Todd was just days, if not hours, away from killing Kayla too. After his imprisonment, the disturbing Amazon reviews were revealed. One of them for padlocks stating solid locks, have 5 of them on a shipping container, and another for a shovel that says to keep it in your car when you need to hide bodies. Listen to episode 5 of the Oddities on Elm Street podcast for the full breakdown of this case.
What makes the American Horror Story series so fascinating are the true stories that are referenced throughout the different seasons. Some of these are obvious, but others are more subtle Easter eggs. This is reference number 2 from Season 1 Murder House. Episode 9 is titled Spooky Little Girl, and it highlights an aspiring actress who's named Elizabeth Short. This is the real name of the victim from the infamous LA Black Dahlia murder. To this day, this is one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries throughout the history of crime, due to its complex and extremely graphic facts. When Elizabeth Short was in her early 20s, she moves to LA in hopes of becoming an aspiring actress. But these dreams would not come true because on January 15th, 1947, a woman is walking her daughter when suddenly she spots something across the street. But as she gets closer, she realizes the item that she thought was a mannequin is actually the mutilated and bisected body of a woman, meaning she was cut in half at the waist. And despite the graphic mutilation that was done, there's not a drop of blood anywhere on site, making it clear to detectives that this was done elsewhere. Aside from the obvious sever at her waist, there was multiple cuts and bruises found throughout her body, and particular sections of skin had even been removed. Aside from the obvious injuries, an autopsy also showed that the cause of death was due to the lacerations and also a hemorrhage on her head from repeated hits to her face. And her face was cut from both corners of her mouth up to her ears, giving the illusion of the infamous Joker smile. And upon further examination, it became clear that whoever did this to Elizabeth must have been from the medical background since the cuts were so intricate. Due to the graphic and horrific nature of this case, it received widespread media attention and truly shocked the nation to the core. Although with all the attention, this case was never solved. But there is a subtle reference in the first season of American Horror Story that points at who may have been responsible for doing this to Elizabeth, due to evidence that surfaced after a man died. And that will be the video that I do tomorrow. If you enjoy this series, follow along as I continue to unbox history and go through these references one by one.
This is the most chilling picture you will see today, and let me explain why. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working at her job in Anchorage, Alaska when she was abducted. Her abductor assured her over and over again that he was only abducting her for ransom. Samantha was waiting for her boyfriend to pick her up from work because she didn't have a vehicle of her own. So this man sent a text message from Samantha's phone to her boyfriend, basically letting him know that she was going away for the weekend and to let her dad know. But Samantha's boyfriend knew that this wasn't like her. And to cause more concern, her boyfriend caught a man going through his truck outside of Samantha's home. The man was searching for Samantha's debit card. Samantha's boyfriend hollered at the man and ran back inside to get help, but by the time he came back out, the man was gone. Weeks go by, and Samantha's boyfriend gets another text from her phone. This time it says, "Connor Park sign under pic of Albert. Ain't she purty?" In Anchorage, there's a park called Connor Bog Park, and at the time, there was a poster of a missing dog named Albert. So police show up to this location and they find this. A photo of Samantha holding the Anchorage Daily News and requesting that $30,000 be deposited into her account. While Samantha's father and the community come together to get this money so that Samantha can be returned home safely, they have no idea that in that picture, Samantha is already gone. She had become the victim of serial unaliver Israel Keys, who had sewn her eyes open for proof of life. We talk about this case in full detail on the most recent episode of my podcast, Oddities on Elm Street. It is one of the worst cases I've ever heard. And to make matters worse, before he could disclose all of the information about his victims, Israel Keys unalived himself in prison, but not without leaving behind 11 skulls believed to represent his 11 victims, drawn in his own blood.
If you're a fan of American Horror Story, then you know most seasons are inspired by true people and events. For example, in Season 1, Murder House, a home invasion occurs which sparks a flashback back to the 60s, when a man brutally attacks 2 nurses while they're home. This scene is inspired by a 1966 Chicago case that was referred to as the crime of the century, when 24-year-old Richard Speck breaks into the house of 9 nursing students, where he brutally assaults, tortures, and ends the lives of 8 women. And in the end, a 9th woman would manage to survive by hiding under her bed until 6 a.m. the next day. It's around 11 p.m. on July 13th, 1966 when Richard uses a knife to cut the screen on the back door of the townhouse. Once through the screen, he unlatches the door and helps himself inside. In the darkness, he walks up the stairs and stops outside the first door that he sees. And there he begins to loudly knock on the door 4 times. 23-year-old Corazon opens the door and sees a man standing there in the hallway with a weapon pointed at her. From that moment, Richard collects Cora and 5 other nurses and brings them to the largest bedroom on the 2nd floor. In there, he begins to use his knife to cut up their bed sheets while he makes makeshift restraints. As he's tying the women up, it's around 11:45 when a 7th woman walks through the front door. Her name is Gloria Jean Davy. She's 22 years old. Gloria was just coming home from a date, and as she was walking through the front door, Richard was crouched behind and pulls out a weapon on her. He then brings her up to the large bedroom upstairs with the rest of the women. There are now 7 women who are restrained and terrified in the large bedroom when suddenly Richard grabs one of the women by her wrist and begins to lead her out the door. His first victim is a 20-year-old woman named Pam. He leads her to the first bedroom on the second floor and would stab her fatally in her heart. As he's in the process of doing this, 2 more women walk through the front door. Their names are Marianne and Suzanne. Both women are also nursing students who live there on site at the townhouse. At this point, it's just before 1 p.m. when both women walk through the door. He quickly runs downstairs and greets them. He strangles Suzanne before he proceeds to stab her 18 times. He then turns to Marianne and he stabs her in her chest, eye, and neck. Their bodies were all found near each other. At this point, 3 women are dead, and he proceeds to take them one by one from the large bedroom on the second floor and begins to murder them. During this horrific assembly line of death, one woman named Corazon, who is bound by her hands and feet, manages to crawl underneath one of the beds that's in the bedroom. She would hide under that bed for 3 hours as she would hear her friends being taken one by one and killed into the next rooms. At this point, it's around 3:30 in the morning when Richard walks back into the bedroom, and he has lost count at how many women were initially there because he had 2 that arrived unannounced to him, and then he also had that one extra woman who came home from her date. So he leaves the home not realizing there's any survivors. It's not until 5:30 in the morning that Corazon feels it's safe to remove her bindings and come out from under the bed. At this point, she's heard complete silence for hours. And as she quickly looks around, she is completely horrified because all of her friends and roommates are now killed in different areas of the house. She runs to a window on the second floor, pushes the screen out, and begins to stand on this little ledge over here and scream for help. It takes nearly 20 minutes for somebody to come out and hear her and come to her aid. Although it's very odd that neighboring townhouses are right here next to their unit, and no one managed to hear the women in the middle of the night being brutally killed. Police then arrive on scene and escort the one lone survivor out of the townhouse. Cora's quick thinking not only saved her life, but it also helped police create a composite sketch based off her testimony, which was the first step to put this man behind bars. This is part 1 of the new series that I'm rolling out just in time for spooky season, where I share what are the inspirations behind different seasons of American Horror Story. If you're interested, follow along. It's going to be a bumpy ride.